Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'm very proud to be announcing the new leg of the Alberta strategy for not only our recovery, but also for our ongoing strategy going forward. You can see that lined up nicely right here. Basically, to be clear, what we're going to be doing going forward is blaming everybody else. That's a really important leg of our strategy. It's not really a big deviation from what we've done so far, but we want to be consistent with that. So the new strategy for Alberta going forward is to not take any responsibility. We're just going to blame everybody else. So with that being said, are there any questions from anyone here?
Mr. Not Jason Kenney, how have you prioritized the safety of Albertans as we're moving back into our soft reopening?
Well, let's be clear. I think it's really important to be clear, especially about this. There's a lot of people to blame for why things have gotten as far as they have with the COVID, and I'm absolutely not one of them, but it's my job to protect the economy above everything else. So when you're talking about safety, I hear you asking me a question about safety for the economy, and that's what I'm going to protect. Mr. Not Jason Kenney, first of all, I want to thank you very much for making yourself available for questions from general media today, not just the Rebel. Just to be clear, the first name is not Jason, the last name is Kenney, so you can refer to me as Mr. Kenney. Thank you, Mr. Kenney. The first question that I wanted to ask has to do with the whole Paul Bunner controversy. There's been multiple First Nations confederacies that have come forward and demanded his resignation, as well as people throughout Alberta. So I'm just curious, how do you justify not taking any action on his termination for the misogynistic, racist, homophobic things that he's written in the past? Well, first of all, I'm thrown for a bit of a loop by that question. I want to be really, really clear. I think that Mr. Bunner's constitutional freedom of expression rights are being violated. I'm very concerned about the mob mentality that's calling for his termination, and I want to be really, really clear. He's expressing views that I've expressed in the past. So there's really nothing wrong with it, and I don't think anyone should be surprised by my support for him, because he's a good guy, and his views have evolved since recently.
And how do you respond to Albertans' concerns about our downgraded credit rating yet again?
Well, listen, there's a lot of reasons for the credit downgrade, and I know that the office that issued that downgrade said that it had a lot to do with us borrowing excessively and the instability of our industries and our economy, but it's really important that we remember this basic principle right here. So I'm going to blame Rachel Notley, because she's an easy target. So yeah, it's Rachel Notley's fault for the credit downgrade. We inherited it, and we'll do something. I don't know what yet, but we will. Probably. Maybe. Almost definitely not. Mr. Kenney, you've made a big deal out of the $10 billion stimulus package that you announced in order to help Alberta recover from not only the economic downturn related to oil and gas, but also from COVID-19. So I just wanted to ask you, a lot of critics have said that there's significant elements, the majority of that plan, that was actually previously announced and has to do with previous packages, and that you're just repackaging it in order to make it seem like it looks bigger than it is. What's your response to people who say things like that? That's a good question, but I want to be clear. Just because we've previously announced something doesn't mean that we can't announce it again and repackage it. It's really important to realize that we're not a party of solutions or creative ideas. We're about a particular mandate, and I'm not going to talk about what that mandate is, but the important thing is, if we announce things a second time, it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. Mr. Kenney, with the funding model that you've applied towards education, where you've kept education funding the same, but you haven't increased enrollment, there's a lot of people who are very concerned about cuts. Calgary had to cut about 300 positions. Edmonton recently announced that it has to cut about 600 positions. So how do you respond to people's concerns that the education system in Alberta is going to be diminished because of that financial structure? It's important to be really clear that a lot of people talk about the value of education. Educated people are much harder to manage, and they critically think more effectively. So our government is committed to making sure that that doesn't happen. So we're going to continue working on that vein. That's the path we're going to pursue, and that's all I have to say about that matter. Do we have a question from Kian somewhere? I want an easy one. Here at the grounds of the Alberta Legislature, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of high school graduating students coming out to pose for pictures, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because it was only a couple of weeks ago that Adriana LaGrange, the Minister of Education, issued a letter to school boards across the province mandating that any graduation ceremony that was held by those school boards had to include all elected officials, particularly MLAs, particularly UCP MLAs. This came about because there were a lot of UCP MLAs who were being told that they could not attend the graduation ceremonies. Now, it's important to realize that all of this is happening during COVID-19 and during a time of social distancing, so to not have extra people invited makes a lot of sense. But apparently there were UCP MLAs who took this really, really personally, and that's why Adriana LaGrange issued this letter. So regardless of all of that, we just want to say happy graduation to the entire graduating class of 2020 from all of us here at The Breakdown. Almost a year ago, we did a deep dive on Canada Action, and we were able to establish some pretty concerning things. First of all, in Canada Action's initial corporate filing, they make it very clear that their goal is to build a national database around issues that affect Canadians, that Canadians are particularly passionate about. That information could be potentially very valuable from a political standpoint, and as it turns out, Canada Action has a lot of overlap with the United Conservative Party. We were able to establish that Health Minister Tyler Shandro was actually Canada Action's lawyer for quite some time and filed multiple years worth of filings for them. So he was very closely affiliated with them. In addition to that, Doug Schweitzer's leadership campaign shared an office address with Canada Action at the same time as he was running to be the leader of the UCP party. We recently found out that despite the fact that Canada Action bills itself as a grassroots organization that's wholly supported by members of the community who are just trying to advocate for Canadian energy and Alberta energy, that's not entirely true. In fact, they received $100,000 from an oil company. So just to be really, really clear, Canada Action doesn't appear to be the grassroots company that they claim to be, because they are receiving corporate sponsorship. They have deep ties to the UCP, and their signs are still up in the windows of the legislature, which is supposed to be a non-partisan building. It's really alarming to me, and should be really alarming to not only all Albertans but all Canadians, the fact that there's a corporate-sponsored advocacy group that still has signs up in the windows of the building that makes the laws in our province. There needs to be a lot more answers provided from this government than they're willing to give, and there needs to be a lot more answers provided from Canada Action, but apparently they haven't issued a statement on this at all.
Doug Schweitzer has introduced some major changes to the Victim of Crime Fund with the introduction of Bill 16. So to start with, what is the Victims of Crime Fund? Well, in short, the Victims of Crime Fund is a program that is funded by fines paid by people who have committed crimes to support the victims of crime. In many cases, that takes the shape of financial support to help victims recover from their injuries, get counseling, and cover expenses. Overall in Alberta, there are 73 victim services units that provide services to the victims of crime. This is an incredibly important service that helps victims of crime recover, and by many accounts, the best of its kind in Canada. Or at least it was. With Bill 16, Doug Schweitzer is creating some major changes to how the fund works, most significantly diverting money from the fund to pay for additional programs like ALERT, which is an interjurisdictional policing organization, as well as initiatives like drug courts, which is great because Alberta needs those. But what Alberta doesn't need is funding diverted away from victims to fund these important programs. There's no reason why they need to be grouped under the same funding model, unless it's to divert funds from victim services, who run extremely efficiently, to these new projects. And based on Doug Schweitzer's recent comments on a weekly radio appearance, that is exactly what he's aiming to do.
So what we've done, the Victims of Crime Fund usually has a budget about $40 million a year. We've actually increased it to $60 million. And we've expanded it to include public safety initiatives like drug treatment courts. That's how we're paying for these drug treatment courts in Alberta, is through the Victims of Crime Fund, by expanding it to include public safety initiatives. The Victims of Crime Fund is going to continue to be there for Albertans. This is kind of what the NDP style is. Like, I've been in the legislature now for just over a year. They're really good at trying to scare people with half information. The Victims of Crime Fund is still going to be there. The grants for victims organizations are still going to be there. We still have benefits for people that have gone through catastrophic events. Like if somebody's been seriously sexually assaulted, somebody has been, murdered, maybe the victim's crime benefit will still be there.
So according to Doug, if you've been seriously sexually assaulted or murdered, you will still have access to the funding. Which leaves us with two pretty big questions. What is the difference between serious sexual assault and not so serious sexual assault? And who gets to make that choice? Also, how does someone who has been murdered collect on the benefits, being murdered and dead and not alive to take money? In all seriousness, this is a terrible move by this government because ultimately it's going to mean that victims of crime are not getting the supports that they need, and that is a tragedy.
Health Minister Tyler Shantics found himself in hot water yet again when he decided to make some changes to a government job posting. The Government Human Resources Department had set up a job posting that was ready to go for a new patient advocate and mental health advocate to work to advocate for patients within the healthcare system. Tyler Shantics decided the day before that posting was supposed to go up to take down the posting and instead appoint ex-UCP Executive Director Janice Harrington to the role. Now, normally this is a job that there would have been a competition for to make sure the most qualified advocate to advocate for patients in the Alberta healthcare system would have been found. But instead, they went with the ex-UCP director, who there has been no evidence of any work in healthcare or healthcare advocacy. One of the reasons why the PCs got kicked out back in 2015 was because Albertans were tired of cronyism. They were tired of political appointments that weren't necessarily in the best interest of Albertans. But it seems like that's exactly what the UCP have returned to. One of the more alarming pieces of legislation that the UCP government has introduced, at least in the last little while, is Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. That act was introduced as a response to a lot of the protests that we saw recently across Canada in regards to railways that were a response to the Wet'suwet'en crisis in BC. And that's a whole different thing to unpack, and we did a whole episode on that, so we're not going to get too far into that today. But the nuts and bolts is that because there were a lot of protests that shut down railway lines, the UCP government felt that this legislation needed to be introduced. But there's some things that they don't talk about too much. So, for example, first of all of the protests that involved the railways were in fact illegal. That already exists under current federal legislation called the Railway Safety Act. And in fact, railway tracks and 50 meters or 50 feet on either side are considered to be private property. And if you go on that without the appropriate permissions, that's considered to be trespassing. So this bill doesn't change whether or not it's illegal to protest on a rail line, because it already is illegal. So the railway blockades were always illegal. And if you actually take a look at the Railway Safety Act, even going on and doing the sort of thing that was happening, it already includes fines of up to $10,000. So a $10,000 fine clearly isn't a deterrent to the people who were doing these protests. It's also worth noting that one of the biggest reasons why the protests weren't torn down and the blockades weren't torn down right away is because the various jurisdictions that were involved were balancing the potential blowback from taking down those blockades versus letting people protest for a short period of time. That's just a reasoned approach to dealing with any kind of protest. So again, just to be clear, it's already illegal to protest on rail lines, and there's already huge fines involved if you do protest on rail lines. Now, there are a lot of legal scholars who are raising a lot of concerns about Bill 1, and it doesn't have to do with just the fact that it duplicates a lot of areas of existing legislation like the Railway Safety Act. There's also some very real concerns in regards to Bill 1 that it actually violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it's also written in a way that's incredibly vague, which potentially makes it incredibly dangerous. So the next obvious question is, how does Bill 1 potentially violate the Charter? Well, first of all, Bill 1 isn't written very well. And in fact, in some of the areas that it refers to, it leaves a lot of room for an interpretation. An easy example is where Bill 1 refers to the Highway Traffic Act. Essentially what Bill 1 does is it says that anywhere that any vehicle is used, that's an area that can be defined as critical infrastructure. Now, according to the Traffic Act, vehicles include things like bicycles and even scooters and arguably even skateboards. That means that there's an argument to be made that sidewalks or even pathways are areas that are considered to be critical infrastructure, and if somebody holds a protest on one of those areas, they're in violation of the bill and could be facing those massive fines. So the things that Bill 1 actually defines are problematic, but where things get really scary in regards to Bill 1 are the things that it doesn't define, because the language of Bill 1 gives the government the ability to literally define anything as essential infrastructure. So this could include anything that's not listed in the bill, but it could also include anything that they could think of. So if they decide that a park is considered to be essential infrastructure, they can name it that, and all of a sudden it's now illegal to protest there. If they want to decide that your backyard is essential infrastructure for whatever reason, this bill gives them the power to do that. And that should be scary to any Albertan, because that's way too much power for any government to have. It's also important to realize that there's no clear timeline that's provided in the bill for how long after something is named essential infrastructure somebody can be charged for being on that property. So it's entirely conceivable that a protest could be taking place somewhere lawfully, and then the government could decide that that place is now considered to be essential infrastructure, and all of the people who gathered there could be charged under that. It's an unlikely scenario, but it's within the powers of this bill to do something like that. And one of the scariest things about the bill is the fact that the only way really for it to be challenged is for somebody to be charged and then make a charter defense. So unless the government decides to walk back this ridiculous bill that they've put forward that infringes on Albertans' freedoms, there's no way to change it until somebody actually gets charged under it. There's no question that Bill 1 is a huge piece of political theater. There's no question it's very poorly written, and there's no question that more than anything, it's been produced to act as a deterrent to prevent people from trying to protest. And again, it's worth remembering that protest is a foundational piece of any functional democracy. The biggest concern with Bill 1, though, is there are no safeguards against it. One of the hallmarks of any strong law is that it has clauses written into it to make sure that it can't be abused. And so far, there's none of those clauses present in Bill 1. So when asked about whether or not the bill could potentially be abused, Jason Kenney's response, as well as the UCP government's response, has largely been, no, it'll be fine, just trust us, we wouldn't do that to you. Maybe it's just me, but given that this government has slashed education funding, they're talking about slashing healthcare funding, they're driving doctors out of the province, they've rolled back protections against GSAs, I'm having it a little bit of a hard time just trusting this government to do the right thing, because the examples that people can think of where they have done the right thing are few and far between. Another one of the big changes that the UCP have introduced has to do with Bill 29, which was introduced by Casey Madu. And basically what it does is it makes radical changes to how campaign finance can work at the municipal level. Some of the big changes include the lift restrictions to the number of candidates that you can choose to finance to. This gets really dangerous, particularly when we're talking about slates of candidates, because a slate of candidates can have a particular political cause. We've seen this already in Calgary, where there's been slates of candidates that have stepped forward saying that they're going to be the conservative group of candidates. The same thing could conceivably happen with an NDP slate or a Liberal slate. And one of the big things that's important about municipal politics is that it doesn't have party alignment. This opens the door for that sort of thing to start happening. It also opens the door for massive contributions to be made. And the worst part of it is we won't know by who until after the election. Because one of the rules that Casey Madu has put into place is that candidates don't have to disclose how much money they've received and who they've received it from until after voters cast their vote. This allows the introduction of dark money into municipal politics, and it's very, very dangerous when we're trying to determine who's going to be governing our cities and our towns across the province. Now, all of this needs to be taken in context with the fact that the UCP government have announced that they will be holding a referendum during the next municipal election. And with that, they've also made some major changes to how third-party advertisers can behave during a referendum. So, first of all, the biggest thing to realize about this referendum is that it accomplishes nothing. It has no force whatsoever, and realistically, we may as well just ask whether or not people like turtles or the color blue, because it doesn't do anything to force the federal government to make any changes to equalization. More to the point, any changes to equalization need to be voted on by the rest of the provinces in the country. So there's very little chance that any major changes are going to happen with equalization, certainly not with this referendum. What this referendum does accomplish, though, is it drives people to the polls, because there's a lot of Albertans who don't understand equalization, who are going to be wanting to make their voices heard. So While all of this is going on, they've made changes to third-party advertising and increased the amount of spending that a third-party advertiser can spend during a municipal election to $500,000. So this is a whole lot of money that we're going to see thrown at the next set of municipal elections in Alberta, and this is going to be very, very dangerous because in combination with the ability of candidates to run slates and to receive funding from one person for multiple candidates, this has a very real chance of upsetting how democracy works at the municipal level in Alberta. There was some mixed news on the topic of safe consumption sites and how the province is choosing to battle the opioid epidemic recently. We'll start with the good news. So the good news is the University of Calgary just completed a study. And while there's no question, the evidence is in that safe consumption sites save lives, the University of Calgary was able to establish that in addition to saving lives, safe consumption sites also save money. In fact, they crunched the numbers and they were able to determine that in Alberta, safe consumption sites have saved taxpayers about $2.3 million. Now you might be wondering how they do that. It's actually really simple. So when somebody goes to a safe consumption site and uses, they are supervised by medical professionals. If they start to have an overdose, that overdose can be reversed there, and that's pretty much the end of the story. When people are overdosing out in the streets or out on their homes, what ends up happening is the 911 gets called. That costs taxpayers in the neighborhood of $1,600 just for the paramedics to come out, and then that person needs to be transported to an emergency room, and potentially, depending on the severity of the overdose and how long it was allowed to sit with that person for, they could potentially need to be admitted to the ICU. So there's no question now that safe consumption sites have a net positive effect, not only in that they save lives, but they save taxpayers money. So that should mean that we should be seeing the UCP government get behind safe consumption sites any day now. The bad news comes from the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Jason Lewan. So despite the overwhelming evidence that safe consumption sites and supervised consumption sites save lives, Jason Lewan decided to hit pause on a new virtual app. This virtual app basically functions like a safe consumption site or a supervised consumption site, where somebody who's using would be observed by their peer, who would then notify EMS if they started to overdose. This is particularly important for remote rural areas where the time that it takes for somebody to be found after they've overdosed can have serious long-term effects. Now, despite the fact that the UCP rolled out the incredibly dodgy health app Babylon, and they seem to have a lot of confidence in virtual care, they've decided to put the pause on this and wait for further review. How many Albertans lose their lives while the government drags their feet on getting this program initiated? We'll never know.
So back on June 6th, I had the privilege of attending the Black Lives Matter vigil that was held downtown. It was an amazing experience. It was very peaceful. It was well organized. I learned a lot. The speakers were very impactful. The crowd was calm and collected. It was beautiful. It's really important to Nate and I that we discuss systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter movement and, of course, what's going on with the First Nations in Canada. But to do that, we need a bit more time. So we want to do our own episode to just fully delve into this issue and not try and fit it into one of our typical episodes. So to our viewers, we are not glossing over the Black Lives Matter movement. We just need more time to do it. So stay tuned for that.
Welcome to a special interview segment of The Breakdown here at the Alberta Legislature. We're here today with Kelly Rudick.
Correct.
And we're here to talk about a budgeting model that isn't necessarily utilized, and maybe that it should. So to start off with, Kelly, we're talking about priority-based budgeting.
Correct, yeah,
okay.
That's the right term.
So pretend that I'm not an economist.
All right.
I'm not an economist. What is...
That's okay, I won't hold it against you.
I appreciate that. What is priority-based budgeting?
So it's a budgeting methodology that, in my estimation, is the best at aligning goals of an organization, or for our purposes, the province or a municipality, aligning their goals with what it is they do and their citizens. So what do citizens want? What are you doing to achieve those things? And allocating your resources towards achieving those things, instead of, you might have heard of results-based budgeting, which is what the province uses right now. Every ministry has some results that they want to achieve. but there's no overlying right now plan for the province and for the citizens. It's gotten a little bit, there's silos in the ministries right now. So priority-based budgeting, tries to align resources towards achieving goals for citizens' sake.
Okay. Operationally, how does it, to the layperson, how would you explain how it works differently than traditional models?
Yeah, okay. So year-to-year budgeting right now, whether it's incremental budgeting, which traditionally what you do is you take what you did last year and you apply some inflationary factors to the resources that are needed to make those things happen. Maybe something's happened in the environment around you, like a big pandemic or something that might have some implications on your costs or what you can do with your labor force. As opposed to taking that bundle of everything you did last year and trying to recreate it the next year, you challenge yourself to say, okay, how well are those things that we do aligning with the things that we've said we want to achieve in as far as goal statements and results.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are the benefits of priority-based budgeting over traditional methods?
So I implemented, our team in Strathcona County implemented priority-based budgeting, and that's, of course, municipal environment.
So this isn't even just theoretical, this is something that has been...
No, this is something that actually has been used a couple of hundred times south of the border, so predominantly an American methodology that's trying to kind of make its way north of the border. Actually, Capital Region, there's a few municipalities that are doing it after following Strathcona County's lead. St. Albert, Fort Saskatchewan, those come to mind. So the difference in incremental budgeting towards priority-based budgeting is, so you're always mining for where your most value lies. Okay. So you judge what you're doing and how much impact it has on achieving goals, as opposed to taking what you did last year and finding a way to maybe arbitrarily add to it to recreate the same thing. Or in our instances, let's say you've heard these things from municipalities before or councils where they say, well, we don't want any more than a 3% increase in our taxes. Okay. Very arbitrary, right? So a really good example for me in Strathcona County was our fire services used PBB to kind of look at what they were doing. And they found an area which they were actually in direct competition with someone privately in the community that was providing first aid services. So they said to themselves, well, not only is it something that might not be aligning as well as maybe some other things that we were doing, but we're in direct competition with a private provider in our community. So that came forward as a candidate to maybe repurpose and reallocate what was traditionally going into that area into something more valuable, as opposed to asking for more the next year to recreate everything as it was the year before.
Okay.
So it forgoes maybe future tax increases by repurposing and reallocating what you already have.
Was there a tangible return on investment? Because I imagine rather than just copying and pasting last year's budget to this year and making a few small changes, which seems to be how a lot of municipalities and provincial governments traditionally do their budgeting.
Right.
What sort of return on investment did Strathcona County see for implementing priority-based budgeting?
So I'd be lying if I said it was the only factor, but Strathcona County was able to have 2 years subsequent of tax decreases.
So they were actually able to decrease taxes to the citizens.
Right, and it was one of the factors. Now, we all know Strathcona County has some assessment that others don't, so they have some industry, which obviously has helped out on the revenue side. But if you're taking that bundle of things the year before, so all things being equal, they still were able to see a tax decrease 2 years in a row using that tool and using that methodology. And it's kind of a culture that you start breeding in your organization to start mining for where all the value is. And you know what? It requires some leadership as well for people to say, in my area, I'm willing to give up maybe some resources or some staff vacancies to reallocate somewhere else where there's more value in the organization.
Do you see, like most of the examples that you used there were municipal, is it something that would be scalable to a provincial level?
So yeah, sometimes that's the argument, is that we're too big, or we're too set, like the culture is too hard to change.
Okay.
And
that sounds like it goes back to the leadership thing that you were talking about.
this is it, right? It's an ingredient that really helps out success. So I know Edmonton's been musing about it. Actually, they used to do it.
Okay.
Province has been, they have a methodology that isn't incremental, that they've placed a lot of weight in, which is results-based budgeting. It is absolutely scalable. So think about Strathcona County has a $300 million budget approximately, maybe $350 now. Edmonton has $3 billion. The province, I mean, how many ministries do we have? How many multiple billions of dollars do we have? Even if you tried to pilot this in some sort of scenario where it's one ministry trying it out and demonstrating results, that might be the way for a big beast that is, a provincial government to think about something like this. I talk about ingredients for success, leadership being one of them. You need a strong strategic plan that has some really well-defined goals in them. The province, in my mind, has not had a really good provincial-wide goal, strategic plan with goals in it, maybe since Premier Stelmach. And Premier Stelmach reached across the partisan lines, asked someone like Anne McClellan to help out with that effort. Still have copies of it in my office. I think it was really well done. Hint, hint. But you know what? It's some leadership stamina. It's some leadership within these siloed areas too, to think corporate first or province first instead of my area. But it's been done successfully before, so you're not recreating the wheel. You've got someone in the region here would be very willing to talk to anybody who would want to listen about the merits of it. So.
Okay. How reactive is it? I mean, one of the big things that we've definitely seen in Alberta in the last 6 months or so was the provincial government released a budget that was predicated on oil prices that were, let's say, optimistic, and certainly unrealized to this point. And then we had the whole reality of COVID come home. Yeah. So we're seeing lots of delays from this provincial government in regards to being able to produce financials for what things are going to look like. Does priority-based budgeting have any sort of increased flexibility for dealing with those kinds of things? Because certainly even in Calgary, where I'm from, we saw with the major hailstorms that just rolled through there, there's no shortage of unexpected events in Alberta that come with a pretty significant price tag.
Yeah, so it is robust enough and resilient enough that I mentioned St. Albert before.
Yeah.
I just talked to one of their staff members. They used PBB principles to make COVID-related decisions in their organization. So okay. COVID has hit us. Where do we have to look in our organization? Where can we repurpose, reallocate? Where can we move people around to address this very prominent situation right now without maybe asking for more or asking for emergent resolutions for more dollars? If you're presented with a challenge if you don't have these long-term goals, or something hits you like a storm that we're facing right now, or the provincial issues that we're facing, the principles of mining for value and finding out where you're getting your most bang for your buck still apply. So it's named priority-based budgeting. I think that's kind of maybe should be named something differently, because people think it's only a budget tool.
Okay.
But it's really used, like I said, with those other elements of strategic planning, et cetera, or something hits you. It's really just digging in and finding out what you do and where the most value is and trying to align to that value.
Now, we've talked a bit about successful examples where priority-based budgeting has been implemented. To play devil's advocate, are there any examples where there have been negative outcomes from organizations or municipalities or whatever the case may be where they've used priority-based budgeting and they've had negative outcomes?
So I don't think negative outcomes, but I would say, I'll use Edmonton for example. They mused about using it several years ago. They started down the road, and you need some strong support in your executive leadership. You need some strong support on council, because this is a culture change. And one of the things that priority-based budgeting does is it identifies, like I said, what you do. So in a big organization like City of Edmonton, when you start doing a little bit more of that forensic look as an organization, and you come up with, I think at the time they did this, they said they did 1,200 different lines of business. The tool starts to break down.
Okay.
So what probably should have happened in that instance was they should have looked at themselves and said, let's wear a citizen hat and not an internal client hat. What do we do for the citizens? Because I would garner a guess that citizens don't have any appetite for talking to you about 1,200 things that you do. If you could roll it up a little bit into maybe a few hundred, which is what Strathcona County got it down to, then using the tool doesn't become so onerous for, it's an onerous effort internally, and that's when you're trying to sell something new and it becomes labored like that.
Yeah.
It just can't get that momentum to really take hold. So that's not to call out the effort before. I'm glad City of Edmonton did that. It's probably a reason why it resonated with me, is because someone in the region was doing it and they went out there and they tried it. I think right now they're thinking about doing it again.
Okay.
City police here have kept kind of that mindset in their organization internally. So, maybe they'll revisit it. But to say that it was a failure, I think would be wrong. I don't know of too many that it has been an outright failure, because somewhere in your organization, it's probably led to somebody thinking that way. And maybe instead of automatically asking for more, they're mining for value themselves.
To a layperson, what would you say would be the biggest thing that you'd like them to understand about the differences between the two? I mean, one of the challenges that we certainly see in this province is that we have these complex ideas, and a lot of, I know that I struggle when it comes to numbers and budgets. My wife will attest to that. So what are the biggest takeaways that you would want people to understand about priority-based budgeting?
Sure. I would say, again, back to something I said before, don't think of it as a budget tool. Think of it as a decision-making tool. So hopefully what would resonate with people and with citizens is, and I know I hear this all the time, what do I get for my taxes? Really, it's just a different conversation that you can have with your constituents around listening to them, one, on what they want. I think we all understand that if we want things, we have to pay for them, yes. But if you genuinely listen to what they want and you have that stamina to say, we're not going to be all things to all people, and in a priority-based world, not everything is a priority, right? So some things will have to give to make other things a priority, right? So if you truly then sit down and have a mature conversation with the public to say, look, we just can't be all things to all people. We're going to try to get the most value for the taxes that you're paying. It may mean that 2% of you will be screaming at me next time we're coming to ask for your vote. But I did my best to get the most value out of the dollars that I could possibly get.
Are you still with Strathcona County?
No, I probably a little bit to do with priority-based budgeting, but February of 2019, I just felt compelled to maybe tell this story more broadly, and wondered what the other side of the equation would look like. So in a private enterprise, so I started my own sole proprietor company.
Okay.
And I'd been getting a lot of calls internally about priority-based budgeting from other municipalities, and I was helping them out as much as I could as a employee of Strathcona County. But now I get to go and talk to people and spend a lot of time with them and really get to know them and have a little bit of a relationship with them instead of just a phone call and off you go. Hopefully you're successful, sort of thing.
One other question, just to clarify. This is not a model that is only limited to municipalities. This can work with other organizations, or?
So interestingly enough, yeah, it's been used lots in municipal environment, and that's what I know the best. However, I've went out and I've used it for a nonprofit. I've went out and used it for, I'm talking to little pockets of the province right now, people that I know. And I just actually started down the road of applying the principles in a family situation.
Okay.
So, you know, same kind of thing. Families have a limited amount of resources year to year. Have they ever sat down and said, as a family, what do we want to achieve 10, 15, 20 years from now? And is what we're doing aligning to what we want to achieve? And so I did that for my family. I have another one that I'm working with right now, all trying to build some sort of model that I can then maybe add some value at the family level, because the principles are strong across many different areas, for sure.
Are there any possible applications for the corporate world?
Absolutely. So especially nowadays, when I think there's this move towards the corporate social responsibility end of things, and there's some really progressive thinking companies who might have those goals that are not just fiscally related, right? So if there's someone who has, you know, staff empowerment or community building in their plans, absolutely. I mean, it could be applied anywhere.
If people want to know, I mean, you're acting as a consultant now with your sole proprietorship.
Yeah.
If people want to know more about your consulting, if they want to know more about priority-based budgeting in general, A, where do they get a hold of you? And B, what are some good resources for them to look into?
Sure. So my company's called It's Logical Strategic Planning Services. Website's www.itslogical.ca. I'll share with you all my credentials after, and maybe that could be shared. There's a center who created priority-based budgeting in Denver, Colorado as well.
Okay.
And they've evolved to a company called ResourceX. And they have some really cool analytical tools and some software packages around this that it's some really cool stuff. They geek out on it like crazy. And so love those guys. Have a strong relationship and partnership with them, actually. So that's ResourceX out of Denver, Colorado. You can Google them. You'll find all sorts of information. You'll find all sorts of places in the States that have done this.
Okay.
Like San Jose, California. They're working with Denver, Colorado right now. I think they've implemented it maybe 200 plus times.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So yeah, it's not new. It's new to us, I think, north of the border still, but it's really they've done some amazing work.
Well, certainly, given the challenging economic and fiscal environment that we see in Alberta right now, hearing that, you know, there's municipalities that have actually been able to cut back on their property taxes, I can see that this would definitely be something that a lot of people would potentially be interested in knowing more about. So
For sure.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come down and chat with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Very much. I'd shake your hand, but, you know, the COVID.
Right, yeah. We'll blow it up.
So thank you again.
Yeah.
And I look forward to chatting with you again about this, hopefully.
Good stuff. Thanks
Awesome.
for the opportunity.
Thank
Great
you.
chat.
And that's it for this episode of The Breakdown. It's been an absolute blast filming up here at the Legislature grounds here in our province's capital of Edmonton, Alberta. We want to say a big thank you in particular to all of our Patreon sponsors, because we are crowdfunded. It is those monthly contributions that allow us to do these sort of things, that pay for the gas for us to be able to get these places. And with that in mind, if you're not already a monthly sponsor of The Breakdown, we'd ask you to consider visiting our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdown AB, and considering signing up for a small monthly sponsorship. Even $5 a month makes a huge difference and helps us continue to do the stuff that we're trying to do here. I also want to throw a special shout out to the show's friend Edwin. Edwin runs a company called The Big Steak, and he started producing politically minded t-shirts and satire t-shirts like the one that I'm wearing right here. I'm not yet personally blocked by Michelle Rempel, although I suspect by the time that this gets to air, I probably will be. So if you're interested in some really good political satire shirts, check out Edwin Munt's website, The Big Steak, and we'll see you soon. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. It's everybody else's fault. So that's, I'm going to do that again.
Our provincial, what? Why is that sounding so hard for me?
He's being persecuted for views. What's that? Oh, they said something.
Hello, I did good.
With the entire band. Do that again. And that had a big impact on the economic stuff. The economic stuff is that
how have you words are hard sometimes.
Mr. Bunner is having his freedom of expression rights violated. Damn it. But it's also because there are parts of...
There's a ladybug and I'm trying to grab it. Fell down.
It's all good.
Our downgraded credit rating? You know, the thing.
A significant portion of that recovery plan was already...
So to start with, what is the Victims of Crime Fund? Crime Fund, why was that said so weird?
Police.
That, okay. You can see my confusion in the gestures.
Of high school kids coming by to take out their graduating pictures. Take out their graduating pictures. They're taking...
I think I'm crying from the wind now. Kenny.
And they've been in a lot of other...
Overall, in Alberta, there are 73 damn it.
So the... Let's do that again. Let's do that again.
Financial support to get victims, sorry.
A data collection firm and the people who founded it. It makes me so sick to my stomach.
What? Okay. I can't see where your eye line is, so I don't know when it's directed at me or not.
Let's say, hey, Leah.
Okay.
With Canada Action as running out of talking. Let's do that one more time.
So we are not by any means doing stuff. I lost my train of thought.
You just sounded so annoyed when you said it. And I've had a lot of sun. Okay, here we go. So that would be super helpful. It was not as good as I wanted it to be. Not only do Safe Consumption saves money, damn it. Yeah, visiting our Patreon page at www. So dumb. Was there? Why is there always noise when I get going on a good riff? I swear to God, these little tiny.
But you're good to go.
Okay. This one here from the legislature's capital. I'm so.
You're all right.
Good.
Seems like you're losing it.
Maybe a little bit.
I'm scared.
And that was terrible. I want to do it again.